Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
All right, welcome. I'm here with the Distributist.
Hello.
And what I really would like to talk about is several videos back now, maybe more than several, but back when Sargon was, trying to annoy the alt-right with his now famous, would you say, posting of
Oh, well, got infamous on Twitter, I guess.
Yeah, as he was posting lots and lots of porn in an attempt to drive off the alt-right somehow. Anyway, you had a number of videos about this where you're questioning what is he really about. And there was a section in that where you talked about classical liberalism of
Yes.
the Enlightenment period and so on. So, and the things you said about it really interested me. There's a lot that classical liberalism influences, especially in modern America. And so I wanted to talk more about that, to sort of get more in depth in classical liberalism. And so to begin with, how would you define classical liberalism?
Well, in the video, I defined liberalism as just sort of a set of beliefs that came out of the late Reformation and then were sort of enthroned and entombed by the Enlightenment and are most closely associated with the Enlightenment thinkers, most specifically John Locke, but those concepts were also repeated by other Enlightenment thinkers who really codified them into a set of legal practices and just general societal guidelines for ethics. So in that regards, I think I labeled them as a little bit of a foundational myth that these things were somehow acultural or supercultural ethical elements available to all people, rather than specific developments that came out of a specific late Reformation, early Enlightenment era set of philosophies. But I think that's all I said about them in that particular video. And that's how I would define liberalism. I guess people would say classical liberalism to distinguish it from just general left of center politics, which is what oftentimes liberalism is used in contemporary American society.
Yeah, well, I think by historical accident, since it was new, it came to mean sort of anything which is new. And of course, the nature of something being new is that as time progresses, it's always got to be changing. It can never be the same thing if it is now new. So the word, without that prefix of classical, it becomes very vague, I think.
I think, though, that one of the things, though, that links the words up, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why liberal seems so non-apropos in our contemporary usage, is that it draws reference to liberty, which was certainly a component of the early Enlightenment and a component of liberal politics throughout the 19th century. And into this century, the 20th century, it was still a large component. I think it only really dropped off really during the Obama administration, where it became more clear that the only liberty that the progressive movement cared about in an absolute sense was sexual liberty. And since then, it seemed more apropos to refer to the left of center people as progressives rather than liberals.
Yeah, well, also with the tie-in, is it got increasingly, for some reason, for historical reasons, associated with very left-wing things like Marxism, which Marxism having essentially nothing whatever to do with liberty. So there are threads that intertwined.
Yeah, I know. I mean, well, I think the Marxists, at least, they were consistently critics of liberalism. Even in the 90s, I remember hearing Marxists critique neoliberalism. I think that when it comes to the far left, I think they've always distanced themselves from the title of liberal, correctly so. I think it was a useful title for center leftists to employ, really from Franklin Roosevelt on down. But I think that has largely to do with the fact that they saw themselves as contrasting the Soviet Union. And in that case, their leftism was defined by liberalism.
But on the other hand, Marxists very often learned that they shouldn't call themselves that as a practical matter because it was very bad salesmanship.
Oh, yeah.
Marxists very much embrace, or at least very often embrace the idea strict accuracy is not particularly necessary with non-Marxists. So there may well also be elements in which
it's Marxistikia.
I'm sorry, what?
It's a Marxistikia, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that could be a myth, but I'll throw that out there.
Yeah. Well, I've heard it described as there's revolutionary truth and what's the other distinction? Official truth. But anyway, there's the things you tell the people who you need to not kill you before you've brought about the revolution, and then there are the things you hold to actually be true. And anyway, so that's getting a little bit far afield from classical liberalism. And so to bring it back a little bit to classical liberalism, I've actually thought about it, and I think this does relate to your description as a little bit like especially coming to the Enlightenment, as like a fungal flowering. That as Christendom died in the aftermath of the Reformation, and there was sort of a secular fungus that inhabited the body, living off the nutrients of it. And like fungi do, they will eventually produce a fruiting body. And then you see it, and sometimes it even can be pretty. There are a few that have nice colors and so on. But it looks, it can look a lot like a plant. It can look like a thing that is really alive on its own. But, as funguses are, they only live off of corpses. They can only digest what something capable of living on its own is actually assembled. And so that it was, and this ties in, as you were saying, that is a section of doctrines that came out, or ideas that came out, that it was, as people still had habits that had been built up during more than a millennia of Christian society, with modifications, and then as it was sort of dying off in the aftermath of the Reformation, where things like, Martin Luther had essentially, or at least greatly attacked the idea of reason. If in certain segments, I'd say he mortally wounded it.
Well, I'd say perhaps maybe it was John Calvin who did it. I mean, who kind of swung the final blow on that. And you could argue that this is an effect of the Reformation, and in some ways it certainly is. But I mean, it would be very, very hard to trace 500 years. I think that what's more apparent, I think at least now, is two things. First of all, that liberalism and the sort of hard Enlightenment values that we really associate with them are very fundamentally linked to Western culture, and they have a very, very hard time seeing expression in other cultures in really the same way that the West likes to imagine that they will take root. Moreover, I think that we're seeing that the older Enlightenment ideas that essentially liberalism and liberty had to coexist with cultural mores that would ensure sort of ethical behavior. You see this very much on display in the Founding Fathers, is essentially giving way to forces that are trying to supplant that very culture. And I think this comes particularly from the 20th century's attempt to marry moderate Marxism with liberal Enlightenment goals. And I think this is where the rubber meets the road, right? Because liberalism obviously had to coexist with an ethical and cultural system. And Marxism really only worked by undermining it. And, for earlier forms of Marxism, that were predominantly economic theories, the moderate adjustment was always just to have a welfare state. But as people got into the 60s, and you have the critical theory school and the Frankfurt school, the focus, I think, because of the failures of economic Marxism, became increasingly on radical cultural displacement. And that immediately severed any ties that current progressive liberals have with early Enlightenment thinking, like the Founding Fathers. And that puts us in the situation that we're in right now.
I would say another thread related to that is that degeneration always happens by generations. And it's something that people tend to miss, even though it's actually in the word. But that, as you see this, like the atheists of the 1800s, the late 1800s, the way they talk, they would be scandalized if you suggested that atheists might endorse the sorts of things that atheists of today are very loudly proclaiming as being necessary. Things like, sexual promiscuity and basically anything modern atheists talk about in sexual morality, the atheists of the 1800s would have been scandalized and said with utter slander to say that an atheist would ever endorse. But what they did is they had grown up in a Christian culture, and they sort of missed the fact that adults, children imprint on how they're raised, and then they tend to fixate there. And adults change somewhat, but not very much, and especially not by habit. But so when an adult takes up something very different than the way they're raised, they don't tend to change their habits all that much. Adult converts, and this is something that's generally, a problem that adult converts have in religions, is it's really, really hard to make yourself a part of whatever the thing you've converted into is. Yes. And you never really get there the way that people raised in it do, because you don't have any of the instincts.
Yeah, I'm a convert myself. That's definitely an issue. You definitely have a more of a nomadic feeling to your faith commitment.
Yeah, and so I myself am a convert to Catholicism, and I'm still not culturally Catholic. I believe it very thoroughly. I know a great deal more theology than many people who are raised cradle Catholics, but on the other hand, I'm not culturally Catholic as much as I'm trying, to become so. It's just really, really hard to take it on, even though it is what I am trying to do. Now, on the flip side, people who abandon religion, well, they still have, they are essentially converts over to atheism. But again, the same thing kind of in reverse, they don't acclimate very well. The radical freedom to do whatever you want, as they put on the, Dawkins, or someone associated with Dawkins, or that Dawkins approved of, or something like that, put it on the side of, buses, saying there's almost certainly no hell, so stop worrying and get on with your life.
Yeah. Is there anyone more Anglican than Sargon of Akkad? If there is, I have not met them, because he is the most Anglican person in his temperament I've ever met. Always looking for the middle ground. But that's certainly true, and that's sort of the delayed effect that allows sort of destructive cultural change to kind of keep on perpetuating itself.
Well, exactly. And then when people raise their children don't have any of those habits that they had. Their children didn't imprint on it. So when they raise their children with that sort of idea, they don't realize that children who did not imprint on the same things they imprinted on will not behave in the same ways as adults that they themselves behave as adults. And it seems to always, generation after generation, just be a complete shock to people that if you raise your children with some sort of liberty, they will in fact make different decisions than you did when you encountered that liberty as an adult.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why in my latest video, I did a series on the sexual revolution. And in my second part of the series, I think I said something like, I'm an older millennial, and I think that the millennial generation is the first generation to really be a product of the sexual revolution. All other generations had to contend with a more or less hard version of the previous sexual ethics. Even the Gen Xers who grew up in the 80s, they still had to deal with that understanding that people just didn't have sex. I think there is a movie on Netflix called Stranger Things, right? I don't know if you've seen it.
I haven't. I think I've heard
you haven't. Yeah, it takes place in the 80s, and so it's full of 80s motifs. And there's a girl who loses her virginity when she's 17, and it's a huge scandal. This wouldn't happen in the 2000s. It would always be assumed that everyone was having premarital sex. If it was just unless it was a specifically conservative community. And so the thing is I think that really it is the millennial generation that is the children of the sexual revolution, not the baby boomers. Baby boomers were just sticking their toes into it. And so that's why we have that's why these things suddenly happen, right? SJWs suddenly happen, even though the SJWs were a product probably of earlier social movements. These things suddenly come about now rather than when the ball was put into motion much earlier.
Oh yeah, there's an interesting phenomenon. Anyone who's ever worked a nail out of wood is familiar with that. You get hold of it and you push it back and forth, and it almost doesn't move. And you
Yeah.
shove on it, and you pull, and you shove on, you pull, and you shove on it, and pull. And for a while, it feels like nothing's happening. And then you start getting a little bit, and then it just suddenly comes out.
Yeah.
And it feels like it was like an all of a sudden thing right at the very end. But most of the work was in that beginning where you don't notice any of the changes happening as you push and you pull and you push and you pull on it. But you're compressing the wood ever so slightly enough that you can get a little bit more momentum. And so the last little bit is always kind of, as you say, it's a shock when it happens. When something finally works loose.
And the sexual revolution, that was certainly gay marriage. That's why all of these crazy things started happening after gay marriage. I mean, gay marriage was a fait accompli because of the sexual revolution. But it was the last part of the sexual revolution. It was the completion of the journey. Because at that point, we came to an understanding that the sexual revolution itself could rewrite the institutions that had been developed by the previous culture, as opposed to simply provide an alternative to them. And at that point, really everything was on the table. Anything that could possibly be asked for by the progressives was a possibility after gay marriage. Well, it certainly was not before. And so I think that, although I think that in a lot of ways the culture war that was fought to essentially oppose gay marriage was in some sense foolish and doomed, it was certainly not, the people who defended the traditional view of marriage were certainly not incorrect to see it as a watershed moment. And this is essentially what facilitated the rise of, I mean, the SJW had been developed for years in colleges, but this is what the victory in gay marriage is what essentially created the situation where the modern triumphalist progressive activist took the stage in a very, very large way.
Now, I would trace back, I myself trace back gay marriage in no small part to the idea, or to the rise of divorce, if not in a direct sense, that there's a common cause, I think, between them.
The two things that caused it was no-fault divorce and birth control.
Well, actually, no-fault divorce is kind of interesting, having looked into the history of it. So the first thing is when the U.S. in the United States, the Census Bureau started keeping track of divorce back in 1870, and it was keeping track of divorce on a per 1,000 people basis, and which is a slightly odd way of keeping track of it because ideally you'd keep track of it on a per marriage basis. But they're also keeping track of marriage rates, and so I looked at graphing the two of them. Along. So you will occasionally, like in World War II, you'll see like dips in both and then spikes in both. During World War II, a dip in both and spike. But the thing I found very interesting is starting in 1870, the divorce rate started rising. And it was fairly slow, but actually it was between, basically if you plot from 1870, actually I think if that's, I forget if I'm hearing for you correctly or not. But basically, if 1870 is over here, and here is 2010 roughly. If you plot a straight line between those two things, you'll see a few blips. Like there's some stuff around World War II, and there's a dip and then a rise, then it kind of settles back. And then the introduction of no-fault divorce in the 70s, you see a spike, and then it kind of levels off until it hits where that line was headed. And the thing is, having looked into, not very thoroughly, but having looked into no-fault divorce a bit, the main arguments in favor of no-fault divorce were not, in fact, about loosening the culture or making divorce more available.
No, they weren't.
They were about recognizing the current reality where everybody was just lying in court.
Yeah.
And so, if everyone has to lie in court, or if people are so willing to lie in court, this is counterproductive towards having respect for the law. So let's just get rid of the fault requirement so we don't just have everybody getting used to lying in court under oath and normalizing that.
This would be commensurate with the idea that marriage as a religious institution dropped off in the late 19th century when we had our first real drop in religiosity. And then this had a fluctuation that roughly correlated with the religiosity, culminating in no-fault divorce, where essentially probably the lesser religious people wanted to get divorces because they're getting forced into what was effectively a Christian institution. And that being granted, the next time there was a huge drop in religiosity, the full force of that drop in religiosity was immediately manifest in the increased divorce rates, and that would be the huge increase in the 70s. But otherwise, the trend would essentially follow the slower decline of religiosity that was ordinarily experienced through the introduction of modernity.
I think there's some other things that are going on as well, because the divorce is something that exists throughout cultures, throughout the world, and throughout history. Our extremely high divorce rates are, I believe, fairly unusual. They're in far more than just the United States. But there's something about
unusual in what context?
Cultures over the last 2,000 years. I mean, roughly.
Oh yes, certainly.
That it seems to be something also correlated to our wealth. That the way wealth, technology is making wealth in an absolute sense distributed it's very common to be wealthy in an absolute sense. Compare the amount of work that you can cause to happen, the number of items, well-made items that you can own now to what somebody could 200 years ago. And it's only a very wealthy person who could, have as much light as almost everybody has at nighttime, who can own so much clothing, who can, that your dishes are done, that your laundry gets done, not by you. Required servants 200 years ago to go and beat your laundry in the river, in a wash tub. Now we just throw it in a machine, so we've got a robot servant. But if you look at that in absolute sense, and you consider that as what is your ability to have something done without you doing the labor, we are, in that sense, fairly wealthy in an absolute sense. That's spreading very broadly. And so as this wealth spreads, it seems to me like that's having something of a generally destabilizing effect.
No, modernity is what's essentially causing this. I don't think that it's... The thing is, I don't think that it's really beyond... we can resist this, It's not... This is not something that we can... I think modernity is what causes this, but I don't think that resistance against modernity is futile.
Oh, no, I don't mean it is. I just mean there's an increase in temptation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's just going to be this time period that we're going to experience as a human race where the part of the human race that is essentially giving into modernity and participating in a culture that's ultimately destructive to the larger project of humanity is going to be we're going to have to live with that reality. We're going to have to live with the reality that we're in a culture that is, by its very nature, not something that's sustainable in the long run. But I think eventually, with that caveat, the sort of resistant strain of the modernity-resistant strain of humanity will come out, just because modern man doesn't have children.
Yeah, there's a great line from Chesterton about that, but I can't pull it out properly, so I won't butcher the quote. But in broad strokes, it was about how that modern idea of that a great deal of modernity is about giving into cowardice. That it's about just not having the courage to do anything and patting yourself on the back for it, and just pampering yourself in never doing anything courageous. And it takes courage to have children. That's, I think, a big part of modern man doesn't have children. Children are a lot of work. Children are hard. They yell at you all the time. They have constant needs. It's a lot of work to raise children. It's also just looking at the prospect of children and seeing how much work they are. Only fools don't realize that they're getting into a lot of work, that they're signing up for something that's going to be difficult. And so a lot of people look at that and just say, no, I'll have a dog or a cat instead. It's going to be a lot easier. And a lot of people do seem to be taking that option.
Yeah.
And on a cost-benefit analysis, like if your goal is to avoid as much suffering as you possibly can, then yeah, stay away from children. Because to have children is to guarantee you're going to do a fair amount of suffering. Very worthwhile suffering, but your life is going to be less pleasant because you're going to be doing a lot of work for people who have a lot of needs. And actually, there's another part, as one person I heard said, that having children is to have your heart permanently outside of your body. That children get hurt, children get disappointed, and it just hurts every time you see your children disappointed or hurt. and there's absolutely no cure for it. Like when you see your child with a friend, and the fact that they're a young child, so they don't have well-developed social skills, and so things go wrong, you feel terrible for them. You can see it going wrong, but it would be a disaster if you stepped in and used your social skills in place of your child's. They never developed their own that way. So you have to let them make mistakes, and you have to let them get hurt. So there's absolutely nothing you can do. It is signing up for suffering to have children. I mean, there are also good things too. They can be a tremendous amount of fun. They're unimaginably cute. I mean, when I had my children, the amount of cuteness in the world went up by a factor of about 4. Total cuteness. You can take every kitten and sloth and everything. And, when my child came into the world, the amount of cuteness in the world more than doubled. So, I mean, I'm not saying that children aren't worth it, but like all things that are very good, you can't have things that are very good without suffering. But the modern world is fixated on giving into its cowardice. And so Chesterton had this line about, sort of, looking down on this. Cowardice is the most understandable vice in the world, but it is the most repugnant virtue. And the thing is, in the sense that cowards will try to pretend that their cowardice is virtue.
Yes, yeah.
And so if somebody is, shrinking back from something out of cowardice, it's the most understandable vice in the world. But the moment they ask you to praise them for it, it becomes the most disgusting virtue you could imagine. And so you're saying, but so when it comes to these people who are too scared to have children, the one comfort in this whole thing is that they shall only last for one generation.
Well, the thing is that the modernity does have, at this point, multi-generational spread because of its ability to essentially convert people from a more traditionalist background. But eventually I'd say eventually the slower process of traditionalism is going to win out. It's just the question of how long and how much destruction it's going to cause in the meantime.
Well, and there's a related thing too with the parasitism of modern people who don't have their own children, but try to convert other people's children who more traditional children, is that there is in the American sort of pluralism, the American sort of compromise, where everyone sort of gets along and everyone's kind of nice. There's something of a benefit to it somewhat benefits the people who are trying to do this. The more stark these things become, and the more, frankly, worse that modernists become, because as they, increasingly, the further they get on all virtues, the less they regard things like telling the truth, even, the more there becomes a stark difference, and the less. It's in the same way that creepy-looking older people hanging around school playgrounds don't get very much time there anymore.
Yes.
In a similar sort of way, the worse society degenerates, the less time that modernists will get to hang around the children of Christians. In, I think, a somewhat similar way to what you saw in the ancient world.
Perhaps. Perhaps. I could think of some situations where that wouldn't occur.
Well, it'll vary, but
things get very bad. Yeah, sure.
Well, I'm thinking decades. I'm thinking 2, 4, 6, 8 decades down the road. Because it's interesting to look at how people in the 200s, the 300s, the 400s talked about pagan society. Because it was just very natural to talk about how truly awful pagan society was. And, without exaggeration, I mean, infanticide was a common thing in pagan society at the time. It took Christianity a long time to kill infanticide off. I mean, all sorts of rather grotesque depravities were relatively accepted within pagan society. Maybe not as the cream of the crop, but these were things that happened, and they happened. They're just kind of accepted. And so there is a very, very large disconnect between Christian society and pagan society. Just as you raise your children, you raise them to be aware of just how truly awful pagan society is. Things like, I'm going to Carthage, which is kind of early, but being
that would not be a society that Christianity had interaction with.
It wouldn't, but it's an extreme example, because you can find infanticide. The infanticide of Carthage, where they'd actually burn their children to Moloch, is very extreme, and it does predate. It does predate Christianity. The Romans exterminated Carthage prior to Christians coming on, but it's a very striking image, and the infanticide of before, when you have a child that you don't really want to take care of for whatever reason, so you just kill them off, was something that was by no means limited to Carthage. So, that sort of thing, the having of slaves, the treating of slaves like, the treating of slaves is highly disposable. The list sort of goes on and on. The low regard for marriage that was common, so that St. Augustine himself had a concubine. He had a son by his concubine for 10, 20 years, I think, that he was with her. I forget the exact details. And it was only when he became a Christian that he finally renounced living with the for those who don't know, which is probably a lot of people, the nature of concubinage in ancient Rome. Concubine was somebody that you lived with, but you in the same manner that husband and wife lived together, but you weren't legally married.
It'd be like a mistress.
Yes, although mistress kind of carries a connotation of secret, whereas concubinage was out in the open. It also had some of the elements of the modern concept of friends with benefits, almost. That's to say, there's no, that there'd be sexual relations, but there was no obligation of any kind. And so that was something explicitly part of the whole concubinage relationship, was that the two of you would have sex together, but you were in no way contracting any sort of obligation to the person, or particularly to the children that you would engender. And because the whole thing in Roman society, like, marriage was very important for property reasons and so on. And so you might sleep with a person who didn't fit with you socially, but you would never contract any sort of obligations to them because they were just beneath you, or beneath them, depending on which one you're talking about. So that's what concubinage was about. It was a relationship where you were together, but with no obligations. It wasn't any sort of formal marriage. It wasn't a property, anything like that. So, that sort of thing was a common way of dealing with the fact that you might have to put off marriage for 10 or 20 years, as an adult. So just instead sleep around.
Yeah.
You're screwing people over, but,
So we're linking this to the modern world, right? Like, you're saying that this is similar to the situation that we have now?
It is, and it's also, I'm talking about the direction that what we're in is headed to. Because it's one thing about millennials. Now, I grew up in the 80s, actually. And so what you said about it, I think, is true, because, my parents grew up in the 60s, but even so, they grew up with people who had a very traditional idea of sexual morality. And people tend to be fairly conservative about what they teach their children. In fact, one of the best tests for whether or not a person really, truly believes something is whether they're willing to teach it to a 5-year-old. Because the thing is, 5-year-olds will believe you. And that's kind of scary. When we talk to adults, you can say whatever, because, it's on them if they actually believe you.
Yeah.
But a 5-year-old will, so you have to actually really mean it. And that kind of scares people. And so people are careful with what they teach young children. So there's, I think, a natural sort of conservatism where they didn't really pass on sort of what they believed very much. They kind of went back to, like, well, this is how I was raised, so I'm going to raise my children the way I was raised. And then when they hit teenagers, they'll sort of, talk about, well, okay, you're going to sleep around now. But by then you've already raised people a fair amount. So I think what you said was very correct there, about how we were raised.
There's no good way to teach a sexual revolution to children. I was going to do a 5th part of the sexual revolution series, and that is just imagine if parents were honest about the full implications of sexual life in the modern world with their teenagers. I'm just like, I don't really have the skill to do this, but I was thinking of doing like an animated comic where sexual revolution dad and feminist mom explain to their daughter going away to college what the next 10 years of her sexual experience will be, with like deadpan honesty. And the daughter will be like, "Oh yeah, I'm totally looking to meet my soulmate, and maybe settle in and have a kid." And their friends will be like, "Ha ha, you naive little girl," like. Because I mean, nobody. The thing is, that this is the innuendo that goes. It's turned. When people explain sex to their children in the 50s and 60s, there's a certain amount of candor there. Because I feel like I'm diverting to sex constantly because I just did a series on that. But I mean, this is relevant, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I mean, like, but explaining sex to people in the 60s, there's a certain amount of candor. In the modern world, there really isn't, because no one's saying what's going on. Like, no one's actually honest about what our sexual culture looks like right now. Very few people get married. There's a lot of emotionally damaging sex going on. In fact, that's the majority of it. But we're all pretending like that's not happening. And that's what creates the need for myths. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, imagine, take it back a little bit from the teenage years. Imagine explaining to, like, a 7-year-old when they ask, where do children come from? Well, when two people who are hooking up with each other either forget to use protection or it fails, then their life is ruined with someone like you.
Yeah.
How well is that going to go?
That would be the honest version, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Imagine,
honest trailer version of the honest trailer version of the sexual revolution.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, imagine starting off there. So not just so imagine crushing the whole soulmate thing, or trying to find that. Imagine you actually did start from children, where you explained that basically your goal is to masturbate in other people as much as you can, but occasionally this goes wrong, and if you can't kill them before they manage to breed, you're then stuck with them, unless you give them up for adoption. So as you're going about this, don't do drugs for some reason. You use sex instead, and endogenous, endorphins are much better, because you can't overdose on them. Your body will limit how much you produce, but you might ruin your life with children. I don't mean I don't love you, but even so, don't have children, at least not until you're really, really old, and they're really hard. I can't even imagine how that honest conversation would go. I think it's not. I mean,
the thing. This is why you need rape culture and patriarchy. They need to be the Satans that, or toxic masculinity, right? Like these are the devils that have poisoned the Garden of Eden that would have otherwise been the sexual revolution, right? It's because toxic masculinity crept in the night and made women feel bad about hooking up with 5 people in 1 week, right? Like, that's the explanation, right? It's either you're repress your sexuality, or that was the old explanation for a woman feeling bad about sleeping with 5 people with no emotional connection was, oh, okay, it's on you. Like Freud says, you've repressed your sexuality and you need to get over this bourgeoisie thing. But that didn't go over very well because women didn't buy it. So then it was toxic masculinity, or rape culture, or some combination, right? With the understanding that, like, I can tell when feminists are repeating these mantras, toxic masculinity exists to essentially overcome any consequences of the culture that we've created that really result in emotional baggage of a more minor type, and rape culture is used to essentially excuse the very predictable but much more the very predictable but somewhat more aggressively malevolent behavior that comes out of this culture. So that's what's going on, essentially.
Yeah, well, isn't toxic masculinity the term for any masculinity which is based on taking materialism seriously? That's to say, any masculinity which is not. That's to say, any masculinity. The masculinity as shaped by faithful Christianity is the non-toxic version, and anything else is essentially the toxic version. Except the problem is because you can't, because materialists
That's
can't.
not how feminists and
No. That's the problem. Being materialists themselves, they can't blame it on what they hold to be true.
Yeah.
But just consider for one moment. Okay, you're just a collection of matter that's here because your parents happen to have made you, and so on back and forth, backwards. Because by sheer accident, stuff happened to make things that were like themselves. So here you are, didn't ask to be made, nothing actually wanted to make you, you're just here. You have a bunch of urges that only exist because they happen to result in you being here, but by this string of coincidences. Mm-hmm. So one of these is that you actually do feel good when you engage in sexual behavior with somebody who so I'm speaking specifically of men because we're talking about toxic masculinity. So when you do certain things with a woman, that happens to stimulate some of these things that, you get pleasure rewards in order to try to get you to make children. But if you're clever, you can avoid the children. And so you can reap as many of the pleasure rewards as possible because, you're just here by accident with no meaning. What else are you going to do? So if you take this all seriously, why on earth would you ever respect a woman? Mm-hmm. Bear in mind, a woman is also just a sheer coincidence of matter with no meaning of any kind.
We respect her as a client.
Well, but why?
Well,
from a purely materialist standpoint,
it's a corporate. You're expecting her to be a repeat customer or something like that, right? It's sort of a corporatized model of sexuality.
Well, okay, but suppose
you're interested in your brand recognition or whatever. I guess in some ultimate sense, taking materialism seriously means that we would have absolutely no human dignity, but I think very few people look at it like that. I think a much more close approximation is people look at this stuff as if they're doing corporate value transactions. They still see people as agents that can make decisions, and they need to interact with those decisions. So they're interested in how those decisions interact in some marketplace. But they're not interested in any kind of more consequential view of the person other than that.
Well, and I think that is accurate as a generalization. But since as I understand it at least, toxic masculinity is often applied only to a subset of people. If you consider only a subset, say take the more, take the most attractive 10% of people who don't need great brand recognition because there's a steady stream of new customers who, mm-hmm. Especially in modern contexts, don't have a particularly good way of vetting you, against others. Because if you meet somebody where you don't even know their name, it's not like you've got a particularly good way of looking up their Yelp reviews or something. Mm-hmm. So,
although that people have been, the feminists have been trying to make a Yelp for men for quite some time now.
It makes sense.
They're doing all of these things. They've been trying to do this Yelp for exes. Specifically for men, because the reason why this always fails is that men use it to complain about women, and women really hate that, so they shut it down. But they've been trying to do this whole thing where you can sort of collectivize a report of rape so that it builds up, so it crests, and all this stuff. They're essentially trying to reinforce cultural norms that existed prior to the sexual revolution.
Yes, for good reason, I think.
Mm-hmm. I agree for good reason, but that's what essentially these things are aimed at. I think that's what people know this stuff. We act like the thing is that Christians they go, well, nobody realizes this is unstable. People know this is unstable. Everybody, all the feminists know that the sexual culture they brought about is unstable. They're creating all of these terms as a mechanism for handling the decline and collapse when it eventually comes. And this is actually, to come full circle, this comes back to the whole collapse of modernity deal. We'll wait for things to get worse and then we'll come back. There's a problem with this. And that is the people who are currently in control of the culture are experts at managing crises. So any minor explosion or crisis that happens, they'll be brought back in constantly as the people who get to come in and clean up the mess and put everything back in a new. So sexuality fails, guess what? Feminism gets to decide what gets done to make sexuality work again. The black family fails. Okay, well, let's get the people from the 60s to come here and tell us how to make it more better, or to integrate it into modern society. So the thing is, there's this anti-fragile nature to this thing, because they control the institutions that really, they're essentially the paramedics. When there's any kind of minor crisis, these guys can get brought back in to fix it. So it's not going to get tossed back to traditionalists unless there's a crisis that's so big that it just obliterates a huge part of that apparatus that allows them to continuously come back in and present themselves as the solution to the problem they created.
Just to clarify, the thing I was talking about as things progress and get worse is not that culture at large will toss things back to the traditionalists, but rather that the traditionalists will become increasingly isolate themselves in such a way that protects their children from being exposed to. There are obvious limits. If you go like full Marxist and steal people's children and make things like homeschooling illegal, then you get into some real problems. Although
which I guarantee the progressives have on their agenda.
Oh, they desperately want it. Whether or not they can achieve it is a different matter. And I think
but the thing is, they in some sense they can achieve it, at least temporarily, by continuing to bring in different immigrants, and this would be fine in a different age. But what it does is it creates a huge percentage of the people who think that they'd rather have the government manage their affairs, because things are just too confusing in these super urban areas, and so laws get passed that can be then used to suppress their enemies in areas where they don't like them.
That's true.
Anti-homeschooling laws would be the perfect example. For instance, if I wanted to ban homeschooling, what I would do is I'd bring in a lot of Muslims from like Algeria and Somalia, right? Like they're going to set up like Sharia schools in like Chicago and New York. There's going to be abuses. Like then when there finally is an explosion of abuse, like you have like the anti such and such law of like 2026, and then like that law becomes precedence for suppressing like your Christian and Catholic homeschool like in the sticks.
I can see that as a technique, although in a broad sense,
I guarantee that's exactly what's going to. I mean, I don't feel like I always don't like making predictions, but I feel like I know progressives enough to know that that's exactly what they're going to do.
I certainly will believe you that that's what they're going to try to do.
Yeah.
I mean, there's sort of, I think, two points on this that are worth bearing in mind. One is that in the 1900s, Marxists bathed the world in blood and didn't manage to wipe out religion. For decades and decades of murdering unimaginably large numbers of people, the Soviets were never able to wipe out the Orthodox Church of Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you had experts. I mean, you had real experts in jackbooted thuggery, and they failed. And the other, and this is a fundamental problem that secular progressives are up against, is that when you basically set out to be an enemy of God, you have the deck stacked against you. And there's a lot you can accomplish as an enemy of God, to be sure. God allows a fairly wide latitude, within the realm of free will. But he never lets the forces of evil win. I mean, they can become they can become ascendant. They can do a lot of evil. The 1900s showed they can do quite a lot of evil, but they have never been allowed to win in an absolute sense. They never have won. Partially, history is never over, but the death of religion has been long anticipated and never been proclaimed many times, but never correctly. It's something we still hear. It's getting a little far afield, but something you see people talking about how religion's almost completely gone by this point. We're almost done with it, and if you look at actual statistics, globally speaking, religion's on the ascendancy, not the decline. Partially related to the fall of the various communist governments that force people to be.
Well, it's also really a differential countrywide birth rates. Religion is declining in the West, but the West is making up a declining percentage of the world population.
Yeah.
And if you looked in the West, a large amount of the birth would come from religious people. So the thing is intergenerationally, atheism grows very little and only from conversion. And that historically, and statistics will bear out from, Pew, that really it's not true in the modern world either. So, I'm not worried about this. And in some ways, this is where I disagree with people like Dean Esme. And I just don't think, first of all, I don't think atheism, like qua atheism, is something that really, I think it had its moment in 2007 and has since just been a declining letter in the world of ideas. It's only effective in argumentation when it's fundamentally contentless. The second it tries to build any idea into itself that has to justify itself against the high standard of evidence it set against religion, it immediately collapses. And that's why you have the continuous branching of atheism into different communities. And in 2007, the world was really prepared to hear that the reason why multiculturalism and liberalism failed worldwide was because religion. They needed someone to blame it on. And George Bush and Osama bin Laden both had one thing in common, namely that they were religious. Boom. The answer kind of writes itself. But in 2016, the questions we're answering are much more complicated and cannot be answered by that explanation anymore. So they need additional theory to bring it in. And the second they do that, they'll have to make assertions that will not stand up to the evidence that they've required for religious people to overcome. And they'll be left out. They'll be left with a contradictory movement. So I think that never. This Napoleon said that maybe this is apocryphal, but never do something to stop an opponent who is working to defeat himself. And that's kind of going on in the atheist community to a large degree. What people have to worry about right now are cultural Marxists, real Marxists, and the alt-right. Those are the people who will dominate the 21st century, or I should say ethnic nationalists of all branch. There'll be Marxists, there'll be ethnic nationalists of a variety of non-white entities, and then there'll be white nationalists. And those are the forces that are going to be fighting over. And then there'll be Islamists and Christians. And those are the forces they'll be fighting over the 21st century.
That's
not
atheism.
Accurate. Yeah.
Well, there's a yes and no to the atheism, contentless atheism. The atheism, atheism, full stop. Yeah, that's never going to be all that big. For no other reason, it's not very interesting. There's just not much you can do with it.
Yeah,
you can find a few people, and it's actually.
Well, there's a time in 2007. It seemed like all the world's questions could be answered, right? Because everyone was religious. Everyone is stupid. Therefore, just don't be stupid, right? That was like the banner year. 2007, 2008 were the banner year of don't be stupid. Yeah,
well, actually, I have to. I kind of missed out on that. I did apologetics when I was a teenager, and then I sort of got into other things and took it's sort of a lull from online things. I was doing a lot more, studying and learning and other things. Only a few years ago, I got into it. So like it's something I mentioned recently. Like I was really shocked by the whole defining atheism as a lack of belief in God. It's just really weird. Like, especially from the rhetorical standpoint, it's very strange. Okay, so you want to claim that you know more about the world than a rock. That's the rhetorical position you want to take up.
Which makes sense because that's the way that atheism becomes a robust argumentative force. By it hoists the burden of proof onto the other party and then just acts as a rejection mechanism.
I've seen that in practice. There's still something a little bit odd, though. I think you have to grant
it's not. I mean, it's odd in the fact that it makes itself incredibly boring, right?
Well, it does. It also puts you in the position of saying that geniuses can be Christians, intelligent people can be Christians, partial idiots can be Christians, but complete idiots are all atheists. That's the company
maybe
you want to say you're in. Oh, okay.
Well, I mean, you mean people who have no knowledge of anything because they don't have sufficient evidence of making any positive statement ever.
or people who just lack the intelligence to be able to come to conclusions.
Yeah.
Somebody who's severely mentally retarded would, in that sense, be an atheist. So, like,
Yes,
all mentally
yes.
retarded people are atheists.
Yes, that would be the conclusion.
Is that really a rhetorical position you want to take up? That, there's geniuses on the other side, but all the idiots are on my side.
No, well, is it all idiots are on my side, but potentially non-idiots are on my side too.
Right.
It's interesting to see how the trick is done, I guess. I just don't think that trick is working anymore, right? Like, this trick worked really well in 2007, 2008. It ain't working anymore because people look out into the world and they understand that the problems that are confronting the world aren't just that some people have beliefs. They see that you can have no beliefs in anything and be a complete nihilist, and people understand that that's not going to do anything, right? I mean, insofar as it goes from people like, I'm trying to think of like. What was like, it goes from like P.Z. Myers was sort of he was like the living embodiment of the atheist that was really really dominated my imagination in 2007, 2008. He's a total idiot. He's a professor somehow, but he's a
biology professor.
Biology professor, yeah. We know the guy then. But I mean, he had his height in 2008 and later. And he embodied the sort of closed mind just shut the doors on your opponents, and that's sufficient to secure this conversation. But you notice that his popularity has been waning even in the atheist community. And you look now, you see where the atheism's at. You have Noel Plum, Sargon of Akkad, T.J. Kirk. So in all of these instances, Sargon of Akkad, T.J. Kirk, and Noel Plum, they're all. I mean, T.J. Kirk probably is the least like this, but they're all sort of broadly associated with positions that are not strictly atheism. Mm-hmm. Noel Plum is associated with sort of scientific investigation. Sargon of Akkad is associated with liberalism. And T.J. Kirk is sort of associated with, I guess, a knee-jerk common sense. They don't sell negation. They sell. I mean, P.Z. Myers sold only negation, but each of these other people sell something else, and then atheism sort of comes as a part of the package deal.
Yeah, and that's actually, I'm glad you said that, because that's sort of where I wanted to go with it. That. It's actually, I don't know if you saw it recently. I was talking with Eve Kaninen, and
I didn't see that actually.
No,
I didn't even know that she was on YouTube. What?
No. Well, she has a YouTube channel. She doesn't actually appear in it.
Okay.
No, this is actually on Twitter, where she posted a card with a quote of mine. It was something that came up in conversation. Was explaining why she saw so much of something. Or a particular sort of position, and I mentioned that something other follows from Marxism. But the thing is, basically, weak-willed atheists tend to become Marxists, whereas strong-willed atheists tend to become libertarians. Mm-hmm. And that it's, and it's sort of, it's a little bit like if you have a magnetic field, a strong magnetic, a positive charge and a negative charge, things that have, and then. The whole spectrum of people enters into this field, and then they get sorted kind of based on what their own personality is like.
Yeah.
If the thing you value, the value, basically, if you're the sort of person who values your independence a lot, you're going to be pulled into the libertarian side. You may call that classical liberalism, but the distinction between, especially the view we tend to have of classical liberalism and libertarianism they're not that distinct from each other. It's the same basic.
Well, one is sort of a purified version of the other, right?
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, for most of humanity, who doesn't feel like I'm definitely in a position where I can completely take care of myself no matter what happens, and for the people who want or feel like they need other people more, which I think is the majority of humanity, they're going to be pulled over towards the Marxist side. And that's where you're going to see more people. It's why
Marxism will win if atheism dominates the world, because I mean, in some sense, libertarianism is a much more healthy individual philosophy to have than Marxism is. But Marxism actually addresses certain collective needs of humanity that libertarianism just does not. And therefore, as a society-wide phenomenon, in the absence of any other ideology, Marxism will win eventually.
Yeah, libertarianism would work well if everybody was, if everybody was, intelligent, strong, healthy,
and male. Male is a critical. This is the thing. The things that libertarianism is class. This is something I've realized very recently when witnessing the alt-right. I don't know if you've seen some of the alt-right. They're everywhere, so you must have seen them, right? It just how many women are a major part of the alt-right. I
haven't seen much, but I got the impression more than libertarian.
What? Yeah. That's the thing. It immediately strikes you is that, wow, the alt-right's way more female than libertarianism is, right? And that's because you can sell fascism to women much more easily than you can sell libertarianism. Libertarianism it's not this idea that like, oh, well, you contract for everything. I don't think it's very fair to the sort of intergenerational sacrifices that, I mean, let's be frank, women are very much asked to make more than men are in our society. That's one thing that feminism has right. And because, I mean, and the alt-right can go and say, like, this is the sacred mother, this motherhood is sacred and must elevated in society to be this noble thing. Women can go like, yeah, but libertarianism is like, well, motherhood's a contract, and you need to like contract for this much amount of time, and this will decrease your career possibilities. And it's like, I mean, come on, like I don't think anyone would people will accept motherhood as a sacred sacrifice for the nobility of the white race, but they're not going to accept it as like a lease agreement.
Yes,
and so like
true.
This is why I've stopped playing video games, but the last video game I really loved was BioShock, and that I love how in BioShock. Have you ever played or heard of BioShock?
I've heard of it. I haven't played it.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if you're a video gamer. I'm not anymore because I just don't have the time. But with YouTube, certainly I don't. But with the game is broadly a parody of Ayn Rand. It's a horror game based around the collapse of a totally libertarian society, and the horror, the sort of the culmination of the horror story is that they figure out a way to turn child stem cells into a mechanism for adults to naturally evolve more intelligence and strength. And as a consequence, the people of the city have devoured their own children to kind of get ahead in this, super Ayn Randish society. I'm doing a lot of paraphrasing in that plot, but that was always the thing with Ayn Rand and this hyper-libertarianism. It's like, where do children fit in this world? I mean, Ayn Rand in her book Atlas Shrugged does describe like a utopia, and you walk through this utopia and you realize that there's no children in this utopia. Like, there's not a single one. There's like 3 females in it, and none of them have any children or any desire to have children. Like, they're sleeping with almost every guy, and it's just like, what? How does this perpetuate itself? It's just like, well, people who choose to sacrifice will sacrifice. I'm like, yeah, like, is your whole society commends against sacrifice, so it's not going to happen. So I think that this is the whole thing. I mean, like, once you start thinking in the intergenerational sense, the sort of like sublime, hyper-artistic, everything balances up libertarianism immediately, that's not like a detail.
Yeah,
it's like the primary like role of society is to be intergenerational.
Yeah, well, there are. I don't want to get into libertarianism.
Sure.
There's one small distinction I do want to draw, which is the philosophical libertarianism of like an Ayn Rand, which is just the sheer insanity you've described. There's also,
it's poor man's Nietzsche.
Kind of. Well, it's poor dumb man's Nietzsche. Ayn Rand was not a genius, especially not nearly as much as she thought she was.
Her prose is pretty insufferable too.
Her prose made Twilight look good.
There's sort of this. I have kind of a perverse. I kind of enjoyed reading. First of all, in high school, I was briefly into Ayn Rand, but even now, I kind of like it's kind of funny, campy, sort of fun. Like they're kind of funny, adventure-y novels. Like I can see reading them very much like adults read Twilight. Is this like a guilty pleasure that's like is fundamentally ridiculous, but it's still this kind of like good campy fun. Like watching Plan 9 from Outer Space or something like that.
Oh yeah, well for a while I'm 150 pages in. I put it down for the last half year, but I was occasionally posting pictures of some of the more ridiculous paragraphs from it on Twitter.
An Atlas Shrugged.
Yes, an Atlas Shrugged. The sex scene in it in the first 150 pages was kind of amazing, especially because I mean it included like dawn happening for like an hour and a half. Because like they started out when it was dawn and they walked a long distance while it was dawn, and I mean the whole thing it was utterly ridiculous. But actually one of the things I did, speaking of Twilight, was there's this really awful paragraph describing somebody, and then I wanted to compare it to Twilight, and so I pulled out my copy of Twilight, which I got halfway through. A friend and I took turns reading it to each other. It's the only way we could suffer through it. And we'd occasionally throw in like fake sentences, and then we'd check like, wait, is that really in there? And we'd almost invariably not get the fake sentences. We'd question real sentences.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I pulled out my copy of Twilight, and bookmark's still in it, and went through. I'm like, what was I complaining about? This isn't so bad. And it's a little bit like if you immerse yourself in complete pitch blackness for half an hour, and then go look at a dim light bulb. It looks super bright. It was that sort of effect. So, I mean, there's that philosophical libertarianism of Ayn Rand, which is just sort of dumb and insane. As you said, it's a poor dumb man's Nietzsche. But there's libertarianism as a political philosophy, which is to say, not that this is a description of real life, just that this is a description of a type of government to use as a compromise in a fallen world. So that people who understood family as the primary or unit of society, that the government exists to take care of families, along those sort of lines. Like there is a political philosophy like that, which I think is also closer to and much more compatible with classical liberalism. So libertarianism as a political philosophy is less wackadoodle than like Ayn Rand is. And it's still not very achievable, precisely because it still requires, it works. Especially, it works for people who can mostly take care of themselves in family units. So I mean, there's very much like you need a family unit. You need, and especially an intergenerational family unit. But an intergenerational family unit is vastly more independent than is an individual. So when you try to, atomize it down to the individual, that becomes the complete and utter ludicrous failure of Ayn Rand. That if you're sort of more trying to atomize down to the level of like an intergenerational family, it still has some real problems, especially where family breaks down. And, interestingly, I've seen that in criticisms like of Saudi Arabian culture, which is very much, a family and in a slightly more extended sense, like tribally based sort of culture. But where, like, it was kind of fascinating. Like, in grad school, I was talking with someone who grew up in Saudi Arabia, and she was mentioning, I don't understand why everyone's so hung up over women not having driver's licenses. You just make one of your brothers take you wherever you want to go. And in that context where everybody, every woman has a bunch of brothers, and B, you have a societal obligation to take your sisters where they want to go. So that, your sisters want to go do something, it is an obligation you have. Everyone expects of you that a bunch of your time has to be dedicated to ferrying your sisters around, being with them in public. That you should never go out in public without a male relative is not very much of a restriction if you can conveniently just make your male relatives take you where you want to go. So in that sort of context, it's very, very family-oriented. But if you have a working family, none of these really, function as restrictions. In fact, they are, that you can't do it yourself is actually primarily a tool to make your brothers do what you want them to do.
And this is actually fundamentally why I do not care about economic concerns. People constantly want me to do streams about distributism, and I am fully aware of the fact that distributism does not have solutions to deal with the economic problems of 2016, because it was developed for a time when the primary capital was land and not finance. But that's not the point. The point of my association with distributism is my understanding that we need an economics that focuses on channeling money through the family. Now, that's why culture is so much more important than economics. Most of the economic problems we have right now, the solutions are too complicated to really embody in a political philosophy. I'll give you some examples. Like the EITC would be a good. Earned income tax credit, or the universal guaranteed income. This is a frequent one from the perspective of libertarians and sort of millennial socialists that they consider good policy. There are an enormous number of ways this could totally F up and backfire. The fact of the matter is you need somebody to try this such that I can imagine this working, you can imagine it not working. The individual policies are too complicated to implement just from a political conversation we have as laymen, where none of us are a PhD economist. In fact, even with PhD economists, you probably couldn't write something on paper. This has to be tried and amended multiple times. So the struggle that we have as political people and thinkers in society is to create a framework for discerning whether a policy is good or not, such that we can continuously try policies and see where they take us.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I will point out one small thing about distributism, that it's not completely land-based. I mean, it comes up a lot in the Chesterton Society that I attend. So
Yeah.
that, well, it is absolutely the case. Like, you need large corporations to do something like make microprocessors. There's no way to run nanometer level fabrication plants without giant corporations.
Yeah, but there goes the majority of growth in society right there, though, right? Big corporations with multinational supply chains, and then the financial institutions to fund them.
Yeah, you have a
what
lot.
else
I mean,
is there? I mean,
there's a lot. Well, I mean, there's a lot that actually can be done on a smaller level that interoperates. I mean, you can come up with versions of distributism whereby, many or even most people operate on a smaller basis, and you have large corporations for only a few things.
I think
they're more necessary.
For instance, you could do software this way, perhaps, right? You could use sort of like the open source model to try to get software as a distributed product that everyone has access to. GNU has a very distributist bent to it, right? Or share alike.
Yeah, I mean, even a lot of distributism also takes compromising on like small companies that are where the workers own the company. The big thing.
There are problems with that, though. I can think of a million right off the top of my head. I mean, I love the idea. Like, I wish all workers could. When workers own the company, though, it essentially means that the company's not going to take large risks.
It does.
I mean, but that's not a detail, though, right? I mean, like, if we're talking about a tech company or anything that like is growing fast, these companies thrive on taking large risks. And if the people making decisions have like their pensions bound up in the decision, it's never going to take those large risks because private individuals can't. So you're going to have that company outcompeted by startups that just like some Goldman Sachs corporation handed them $1 billion, and he handed $1 billion to 20 people, and he knows that 18 of them are going to fail, but still, because they're going to make 100 times as much money as he gave them, it doesn't matter. And so they'll take risks, and then they'll be the surviving company, and the self-owned company where the pensions are bound up with the actual investment decisions will fail because people who own the pensions are going to be like, well, we could go for this new product, but my daughter needs to go to college, and what happens with the 6% likelihood of a failure? So I mean, like right there, like there's what I'm talking about with these questions here, right? Like, we need somebody to act. Absolutely, we need economists to look at this and make sure that we're creating institutions that can support families. But it's so complicated. I'm not so sure how laymen can sit down and hash it out in a way that seems sort of consistent, I suppose.
Yeah, I think they're. I mean, not to go too far into distributism,
Yeah.
because we're several layers, several fields over now. But I think that, as you say, the thing is the important thing in something like this is to really identify what it is we value. That's the really primary discussion. I think you're quite correct about that, because in a sensible distributive system, because you'll find some people who are essentially fundamentalists about it, where they want nothing but individual owned businesses and absolutely nothing else, and that's obviously going to fail. But in a human society, what you'll have is a spectrum of things, from large companies to individually owned businesses, and all sorts of things in between. And that the big question is to ask, what is the society are we actually going to value? Are we going to value stability for families? Are we going to value generating as much wealth as we can? Are we going to are we going to value the ability to maximally regulate everything by the government? There are different things that we can maximally value, and then we can adjust for everything that we do in that iterative process of just living life and making adjustments. What we judge things by is, I think, and you were right in saying this, where we really have the most the most productive conversations on that, because favoring as a general policy, trying to enable people to do things in a smaller manner, is something you can have as a policy that then, when many people are doing the incredibly complicated decisions, they can do them according to those preferences that we as a society have established. So
I think that the values are the important thing. And that's what I want to take from distributism, not the specific economic policy of G.K. Chesterton 100 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with you very much. I've run into those people who occasionally forget that we're not in England in 1913.
And this is with Marxists too. I had this discussion with this guy who was convinced that Marx had the solution. I'm like, even if Marx was science, the probability that he needs no modification in 150 years. He'd be the only scientist in 1848 that has not been massively modified, and that's in a science that's been less predictively accurate than physics or chemistry or any of the fields that have been revolutionized since then. So we have to allow for epistemological looseness when we discuss things like economics or creating societies, and that's why the conversation needs to go in that direction. I only have 5 or 6 more minutes.
Okay.
Well, go ahead. Yeah.
One quick joke on that one is just that, in fairness to this position on Marx, Hegel was, as I understand it, quite a brilliant man, and Marx mostly just plagiarized from Hegel.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have problems with Hegel.
Anyway, so yeah, to bring it back a few fields, because we've sort of been around classical liberalism, and so especially I think here, as we're touching it, we got a little bit too much on this. Libertarianism is being what classical liberalism kind of evolves into when people are trying to say, well, how do we really make this work in practice? And libertarianism has been one of the things that people who like classical liberalism come up with. But I think, it leaves off too many people. It leaves off things like where families don't work. That if you have dysfunctional families, then that does screw over the people in the family. And a lot of people, if nothing else, don't really trust their families very much, especially in a more modern context where families become so loose and people don't feel much obligation. Hence why I think most people do get pulled, especially most materialists in particular, get pulled towards something like Marxism.
Yeah.
Where you have that the state will take care of you. You don't need to depend on anybody around you.
Mm-hmm. It'll solve all economic problems if we just overthrow the capitalist system.
Well, and increasingly the social problems too, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Because, and I think this actually, not that I meant to be talking about your more recent videos, but you're discussing of the sexual marketplace and the sex becoming economized. I think really plays into that view of Marxism as an ever encroaching totalitarian philosophy, in that obviously anarcho-capitalism doesn't work in economics. It also doesn't work in sex. For the reasons I think, to super summarize, the video I saw, the problem is that people are too unequal within the sexual marketplace for a variety of reasons, and so kind of everyone gets screwed over in turns. And so you also have that sort of, well, what's the solution to this? Well, if the economic solution is Marxism, the social solution becomes Marxism as well. That people fundamentally can't just run their lives, because you do look, when people run their lives, they tend to fail. So it pushes people into that sort of, that sort of...
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So classifying that, where you get, some people pull over, classical liberalism, some people get pulled over into sort of the libertarian side of it. Most people get pulled over into more of a Marxist side of it because it doesn't work in practice. What would you say is a viable thing to replace this? For especially, I think the people who find Marxism attractive, I think, need to be talked to somewhat differently, but especially, especially given our backgrounds and so on, I think we're more likely to be able to talk to people who find classical liberalism attractive. And what do you think is what do you think can replace this that actually would work?
I think that the way to replace this is I guess that's sort of the point of my channel. I guess I think they need to understand that that systemizing ideologies to this extent don't work. That we need looser epistemology. But I think the problem is it's not just one thing. There's any number of problems that sort of like attract people to this like hard libertarianist position.
Okay, actually, let me rephrase my question to something a little bit more answerable, especially in a few minutes. What do you think are the first questions that people should set about trying to answer in order to come up with a system that actually will work?
I think the question, first of all, what is good? And then what is humanity meant to be? What is humanity? What does it mean to be a good human? Right. This is the thing, right? Like, maybe I'll probably do a video on this where I want to do a video called "I Am Social Justice Warrior" or something like that, because I think that I want to go out over what social justice used to mean, the fight between Hayek and Rawls. His supposed victory, and then where I think we can interrupt Hayek. Because the idea is Hayek saw social justice as being an immaterial thing that was emergent from the market. But then I think the counterpost is that how do you evaluate the free market as being good? Well, you have to have some standard. And I think even in that, the liberal will see that he's using human well-being as the standard. The only thing that he needs to ask himself is, what does it mean to be fulfilled and live a good human life? And once we start asking that question, I think traditionalism becomes almost inevitable. Because most people, when they think of a thriving human life, they think of family, intergenerational solvability, and all the things that come along with the Christian tradition and the notion of the Christian saint. So, as a final question, maybe would that work?
Yeah. As a starting point, I think it also seems to suggest a related question. Because one thing I notice, a lot of people like simple answers. So, but a lot of people like simple answers that simply fail if you look at how human beings actually work. Mm-hmm. So, relatedly, I guess, the path to wisdom is by learning a very great many things. There's no simple way to describe it. But among the many things that you read and the people that you studied, how would you suggest to people that they start learning about how human beings actually work? Because, you can come up with any theory saying like, well, the path to happiness is just having a green parrot. And of course, if you ever tried that, you just find that people with green parrots are no happier than anyone else. And so this is a complete failure. How would you suggest that people, learn about that and gather some of that data that broadens out their perspective to make it easier for them to recognize, where failed philosophies are going to fail?
Well, I guess it's different than classical liberalism, and classical liberalism and Marxism are two very different beasts. For classical liberals, I think it's going to come with understanding children in education. With Marxists, I think it's a much longer road. But again, I don't think I think I need to do some work on understanding the Marxist psychology a little bit better, because obviously I'm having a hard time reaching them. But I think that for classical liberals, I think it's the interaction with children that really, and the process of intergenerational interaction that really shows why the philosophy is not sufficient in itself.
So to sum up, if you're interested in classical liberalism, learn about what raising children is actually like and about.
Yeah, I guess so. Would that be a good what place to end? I guess, or
yeah. I think that it coming to a head in this is any theory that's supposed to actually interact with reality should be able to fit real reality. So here's some real reality to go find out about if you're not intimately familiar with it. And if you're a classical liberal, odds are very good that you're not very intimately familiar with it.
Mm. Yeah.
So
that's as close as I can come on short notice, I suppose. But thank you for having me on, though.
Thanks very much.
It was a real pleasure. We should do it some other time. I think this is the first live stream I've appeared on where I have my face. Usually, I do every now and then. I do recordings where I appear without my anonymous filter, but this is the first one live. So thank you very much for hosting.
Yeah, thank you very much for talking with me. It's been quite a pleasure and interesting.
All right.
Interesting ride. So
yeah, let's do it again sometime.
Yep. All right, and for anyone listening, may you hit everything you aim at. Bye.
All right. Bye.